Greetings. My name is Adam Engel, the chairman of the Mind and Life Institute. Your Holiness, President Vest, Dr. Sharp, distinguished scientist, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Mind and Life 11, Investigating the Mind. As we start this weekend conference, I'd like to take just a moment to dedicate this meeting to our very dear friend and co-founder, Francisco Varela, who until his passing in 2001 was our scientific visionary, and without whom we would not be here today. We love you, we miss you, and we will never forget you. Science is the dominant paradigm for understanding the nature of reality and providing a knowledge base for improving people's lives. Buddhism is a 2,500-year tradition focused on personal liberation, but not liberation based on theology or faith, but liberation based on understanding the nature of reality and using that understanding to guide us toward personal liberation. So it is the search for the understanding of the nature of reality that is the linkage between science and Buddhism. In the mid-1980s, recognizing that there was no orderly way for science and Buddhism to share their findings and collaborate, Francisco and I approached the Dalai Lama and proposed a week-long in-depth dialogue on Buddhism and cognitive science. He readily accepted, and in 1987, we had Mind and Life 1. Since that time, we've had 10 in-depth discussions on a variety of scientific topics. In 1998, we added collaborative research to our mission. And by that, what we had in mind was a true collaboration between Buddhism and science, where scientists and Buddhists would stand shoulder to shoulder and design the scientific protocols, recruit the subjects, execute the research, analyze the results together, and publish together. In addition, where possible, we would like to collect first-person data and analyze that along with the third-person data. The purpose of this weekend's meeting is to explore in this public setting the wisdom and efficacy of that type of research, and hopefully plot some strategies for its development. Our strategy for doing that is to choose 3 topics as exemplars that are under active investigation by Western science and on which we believe Buddhism has much to contribute: attention and cognitive control, mental imagery, and emotion. In the 4th session, we hope to delineate the scientific threads that have been delineated and maybe plot some strategies for going forward. We've only got 10 hours. It's not very much time, so let's get on with it. Tomorrow, I'll check with you to see how we've done. I now have the honor of introducing to you the president of MIT, Dr. Charles Vest. In Buddhism, we have a saying that you judge the quality of a teacher by looking at the actions and the motivation of the students. And I think the same applies to organizations. In the past year, I've worked intensely with the McGovern Institute at MIT, the Whitehead Institute at MIT, other departments at MIT, and Dr. Vest's office itself. In my entire professional life, I have never worked with an organization that so successfully blends excellence and integrity along with the human values of kindness, cooperation, and respect. To me, that says worlds about the leadership of Dr. Vest and the culture he has created here. Please join me in welcoming Charles M. Vest, president of MIT.
friends, good morning. It's a privilege to welcome all of you to MIT. We are pleased to host this year's Mind and Life meeting. Many of us believe that understanding the human brain and mind will be the great scientific adventure of the 21st century. There is no more profound or worthy subject of study than how we learn, remember, think, and communicate. In other words, how the brain works and what the mind is. And there's the ultimate mystery of consciousness, of which we in Western science speak only haltingly, yet which as human beings we all ponder with awe. There's no field in which major advances will have more profound effects for humanity, health, learning, communication than the brain and cognitive sciences. We hope to find answers to questions that have challenged humankind for millennia. The establishment of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research here at MIT is a reflection of our institutional commitment to these areas of research. Recent scientific advances in the study of the brain and mind build on the rapidly accelerating progress in a broad range of disciplines: cell and molecular biology, brain and cognitive science, neuroscience, artificial intelligence, genomics, and so forth. Important collaborations increasingly extend to other fields such as linguistics. But at the most profound level, these studies challenge those of us in the sciences and technologies to go still further afield, to grapple with insights and challenges from the world's great philosophical and spiritual traditions. That is why this conference is important. It brings together scientists, academics, and Buddhist scholar practitioners, all distinguished in their own fields, to explore topics of common concern in a spirit of open, honest inquiry that is the essence of a university. I'm confident that the people here today, and the different traditions they represent, will learn much from each other, and we are very privileged to host this event. I am particularly honored, of course, to have on our campus with us today His Holiness the Dalai Lama. We are privileged that he will be participating in this conference throughout the next 2 days. But now it is my pleasure to introduce Professor Philip Sharp, founding director of the McGovern Institute for Brain Research, Nobel laureate, and one of the most distinguished scientists of his generation. Phil?
It's a great pleasure for the McGovern Institute to host this conference, Investigating the Mind. The participants in the conference are leaders in fields of cognitive and psychology from around the world, as well as advanced Buddhist scholars. This promises to be a very exciting dialogue between two traditions for understanding the relationship between mind and brain. The McGovern Institute, which was established just 3 years ago with a very generous gift from Lori and Pat McGovern, has the objective to investigate and ultimately understand the biological basis of the higher functions of the human brain. Thus, it's very appropriate that the McGovern Institute play the role of a host for this exciting conference. In fact, Professor Nancy Kinwisher here to my left, a member of the McGovern Institute, is participating in the conference and has participated in panels in preparation for the conference. So we are very excited about the next few days and hearing this conjunction between neuroscience and the tradition of Buddhist thought and meditation. Now it is a very special honor to me to introduce His Holiness. He is the 14th Dalai Lama, leader of Tibetan Buddhism and head of the Tibetan government in exile. He was born of very humble origins and was selected to be the Dalai Lama at the age of 2. His Holiness has an advanced degree in Buddhist philosophy and has been educated by participating on the world stage for over 40 years. He is truly an international scholar and leader. One recognition of the importance of his leadership was the awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize in 1989. I had the pleasure yesterday of attending a press conference with His Holiness. 2 attributes stood out as I listened to his responses to questions. The first was his openness to insights learned through scientific inquiry. I believe this reflects a very deep personal interest in him. And His Holiness has said something that's very important for MIT, that if he were not a monk, he would have lacked to have been an engineer. Thank you. The second attribute was his special... I'll get my timing better. The second attribute was a special humility and compassion for mankind, which was very obvious in his comments and his thoughts. Thus, it is a particular pleasure to introduce His Holiness, the leader of Tibetan Buddhism. Thank you.
And the Nyarajan and the mixing that sem the jigda leveda Namsha Korea mixing that the Shimju Tonanang at the Castle Sanity and those Chatu Shakabuchu to Shishuin.
Eminent scientists, brothers and sisters, it's a great pleasure for me to have this opportunity to participate in conversations with scientists and fellow Buddhist scholars in this wonderful setting of MIT. So I would like to express my appreciation for all those individuals and organizations for making this possible.
I think reason why was the useful dialogue between one of the, I think, Eastern tradition, that's Buddhism, and science. Firstly, I think among 3 civilization, Chinese civilization, Egyptian civilization, then Central Asia's civilization. I think as far as the interest or the enthusiasm to investigate about the reality of external things, and also I think reality about internal. I think here, perhaps I think the Central Asian ancient Indians or the civilization seems, I think very strong to investigate. Through centuries, I think that investigation is carried on. So time of Buddha come, already it's that kind of academic sort of scholarly study already there. So Buddha further sort of, I think, expanded that. Then many great masters, particularly in Sanskrit Buddhism, there's Nalanda tradition. And many explanations, if you look just itself, then no related with the practice of Buddha Dharma, but simply trying to analyze the reality. So that's, I think, the Nalanda tradition. So I believe the human intelligence is something unique thing for human mammals. So the investigation, through investigate, experiment, to expand our knowledge, I think human basic right, and very important. So I'm not only me, but we, some sort of Buddhists here, actually carrying one tradition of Nalanda, which more than 2,000-year-old tradition, and originally come from Buddha. And before that, I think at least 3,000-year-old sort of traditions. Then, me personally, I believe, first I think it is very, very interesting and very useful to explore various ways to expand human knowledge as academic work. Then the second level, I believe every human being, we are part of the humanity. If humanity happy, individual will happy. If humanity in general facing difficulties and disaster, we individual cannot escape from that. So therefore, and particularly in modern time, economy, environment, and also I think sheer population, number of humanity, and also everybody to try to, increase their living standard. So nature is also some problems. So from selfish motivation, you have to think about the world, about humanity. So up to now, it seems everybody making every effort for upliftment of material comfort, material facility, but not adequate pay attention about our inner value. One my commitment, not only just me, I think many people, I think they try to promote human value in order to be a happier world, more compassionate world. So now here, the human intelligence, knowledge alone, no guarantee to bring lasting happiness. And particularly some problems on mental level, the answer must come from warm heart. So human intelligence must combine with sense of responsibility, sense of community, and compassion. These things are, I feel, very, very important, irrespective of whether believer or non-believer. So that's basically, I feel, human value, not religious thing. Religion simply strengthening these basic human values. So on that level, now how to promote this human value. Not through prayer, not through religious sort of teaching, but through awareness. So particularly last several years, I learned as a result of meeting with scientists for health, for proper development of brain of human being, human affection is so important. So I'm trying to seeking some kind of backing from the scientific sort of finding in order to have a healthy body, a happy mind. The sum of these positive emotions are something very relevant. So, as a result of some knowledge from scientific dialogue, now I got a few more reasons to say other people for health reasons, for environment reasons, for peace of mind reasons. The combination of brain and heart is something very crucial. So regarding promotion of human value, the meeting between science and some sort of, some old tradition, I think useful. This is one thing. The second, I think as I mentioned earlier, Buddhism really is carry the investigation about reality. So science also is trying to know the reality. I think up to now, the modern science mainly pay attention about external things, which can see, which can measure, which can
measure and calculate.
Calculate. So seems to see, for example, the Western psychology. I think compare Buddhist psychology, I think modern psychology is still, I think, very young, like a baby. So you see, we can cooperate to further sort of develop. And then similarly, some of the Western scientific sort of explanation about the quantums and these things. Although the essence in Buddhism mentioned there, very much similar. I think same concept, but very detailed. Western scientific sort of knowledge is much more deeper. So then sometimes our knowledge is like baby. So they help from the sort of knowledge from the scientist. It's very useful. So there's one reason. Then second reason, the promotion of religious harmony. That's my another commitment. Now for that, up to now, I think mainly Buddhist scholars involve this dialogue. I think future, eventually, I hope now as far as deeper experience is concerned, the other tradition also similar potential. I noticed some Christian practitioner, as well as some Muslim, particularly I think the Sufism, some really carrying meditations, and Jews also. So naturally, among the Hindus, there are many different, traditions there. One occasion at Kumbh Mela, in one holy place in Allahabad, in India, every 12 years. So, Mahakumbh Mela, every 12 years. So I participated twice. Recently, I also participated. So there are many sadhus who spend in mountains, in snow mountain, several years. Some cases, in snow, remain naked body. So there must be some deeper experiences. So this is not question, obviously, the logical, what say, the samlukish game, which is samluta kanda gachimbuji yene mene kanda nyamnyungu thane, also experiment chat, then they matter something gore.
Regardless of what one may think about their own explanation of the phenomenon that we see, but what I think it is important from the scientific point of view is to try to understand what is the physiology of these individuals who have such capacities.
If we eventually can expand the amount of participants, not only Buddhist, but some other practitioner, I think that also can be a promotion of religious harmony. Of course, I'm not sort of making effort to propagate Buddhism or to show other people, oh, Buddhism is something very special. I don't think that way. So the more people from different traditions come and discuss. And mainly, I think, to show their deeper experiences. In some cases, I do feel Buddhist, I think particularly like myself, has a lot of wala without much sort of experiences. So some of these is the experienced people, I think, really worthwhile to participate. Then third, my commitment is about Tibet. So for that also, some of our Chinese brothers and sisters, consider Tibetan spirituality is very backward. So I want to show them not so backward. so that I think is another reasons. So these are the reasons why I have keen interest about dialogue with scientists. Thank you.
My name's Arthur Zients. This is Ann Harrington. I'm from Amherst College. Ann is from Harvard University. Ann and I will be sharing the responsibilities this weekend as co-moderators. We'll be introduced to a great many Buddhist scholars and scientists. We'll be a kind of line of continuity, bringing the whole thing together. We would also like to express our welcome and gratitude. Welcome to you all who came. Welcome, of course, to His Holiness the Dalai Lama and our Buddhist scholars and scientists. Also, our thanks to the McGovern Institute and MIT for hosting this event.
We also want to say something quite explicitly about the kind of sensibility that we're going to be trying to create in our talks over the next 2 days. We have monks in robes on stage here. We have His Holiness the Dalai Lama in our midst, and it's very difficult. It'll be very difficult not to consider all of this quite exotic. But we don't want to be distracted by the seductions of exoticism in this meeting. We also don't want our great affection and respect for His Holiness to inhibit us from speaking our minds. What the panelists and the speakers have committed to is basically an attitude of straightforwardness and a commitment to being at once open-minded but also tough-minded in engaging with all the claims and arguments that will be on the table over the next 2 days, leavened, as you've already seen, by a considerable amount of humor. There's a lot of joyfulness in these discussions, as well as a lot of hard, rigorous thinking, and it's that balance, that spirit that we're going to try to recreate on the stage with you over the next 2 days.
To begin our session, we're going to start with a presentation by Professor Evan Thompson, who's a philosopher of mind from York University. Evan was a longtime collaborator with Francisco Varela. Some of you may know him as the co-author of the book, The Embodied Mind. And perhaps the greatest homage we can pay to Francisco is to share with you some of the intellectual ambitions and hopes which he and Evan shared and which represent one set of important ideas and aspirations that have animated the Mind and Life dialogues through these many years. So Evan Thompson.
Good morning, Your Holiness, colleagues and friends. It's a great pleasure and honor to be able to speak to you this morning. Francisco Varela was a neurobiologist who worked on the biology of cognition. He was also a practitioner of Buddhist meditation, a student of Buddhist philosophy, and a co-founder of the Mind and Life Institute. He was a pioneer not only in neuroscience, immunology, theoretical biology, and cognitive science, but also in the exchange between Western science and Buddhism. During the last decade of his life, Francisco made groundbreaking experimental and theoretical contributions to our understanding of the large-scale, dynamical brain processes involved in perception and consciousness. Yet he was never content to investigate simply the neural correlates of mind. Francisco wanted to understand the nature of experience itself. In his view, there could be no comprehensive science of the mind without understanding subjective experience. Francisco maintained, furthermore, that scientific understanding of subjective experience requires linking biobehavioral investigations of the mind to rigorous and precise phenomenological investigations. He believed that Buddhism, because of its long-standing traditions of disciplined contemplative study of the mind and critical philosophical analysis, has deep and extensive contributions to make to the scientific investigation of the mind. Thus, Francisco's vision was not that Buddhist contemplatives could become new subjects for experimental research on the neural correlates of mental states, but rather that adept contemplative phenomenologists could become a new kind of scientific collaborator or partner in investigating the mind. To honor the memory and importance of Francisco for this meeting, I would like to take a few minutes to share this vision with you. Over 100 years ago, William James, in his Principles of Psychology, wrote that in the study of subjective mental phenomena, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always. Psychology, as James presented it, is the study of subjective mental phenomena, plus their relations to their objects, to brain states, and to the environment. Whereas physiological psychology studies the relation of mind and brain, as well as the naturally evolved mutual fit of mental faculties and the environment, introspection studies the subjective mental states themselves. Yet, what exactly is introspection? James continued, the word introspection need hardly be defined. It means, of course, the looking into our own minds and reporting what we there discover. Everyone agrees that we there discover states of consciousness. This passage is often quoted, but less often remarked is that James hardly thought introspection is easy or an infallible guide to subjective mental life. Later in his book, when discussing sensed moments of transition in the subjective stream of thought and feeling, he wrote, let anyone try to cut a thought across in the middle and get a look at its section, and he will see how difficult let anyone try to cut a thought across in the middle and get a look at its section, and he will see how difficult the introspective observation of the transitive tracks is. The attempt at introspective analysis in these cases is in fact like seizing a spinning top to catch its motion or trying to turn up the gas quickly enough to see how the darkness looks. James clearly did not think that we know already the nature and full range of thought and feeling simply because we are able to look into our own minds. In 1904, James heard the Theravada Buddhist monk Anagarika Dharmapala lecture at Harvard on the Buddhist conception of mind. According to the Buddhist view, there is no single, permanent, enduring self underlying the stream of mental and physical events. Afterwards, James rose and proclaimed to the audience, "This is the psychology everybody will be studying 25 years from now." By this, he apparently meant not so much Buddhist psychology per se, but rather a psychology of the full developmental range of human consciousness, pursued with a kind of phenomenological precision exemplified by Buddhism. James's prediction, of course, was too optimistic. The words of another psychologist, James McKeen Cattell, also from 1904, indicate the path that much of psychology took in the years to come. Quote, "It is usually no more necessary for the subject in a psychology experiment to be a psychologist than it is for the vivisected frog to be a physiologist." The strategy psychology pursued was to objectify the mind as much as possible, either as behavioral performance, physiological response, or non-conscious information processing. Consciousness became a taboo term, introspection was rejected as a method for investigating the mind, and it was no longer necessary for the psychologist to have any disciplined first-person expertise in the subjectivity of mental life. Although there were notable exceptions to this trend, such as Gestalt psychology and phenomenological psychology, this taboo of subjectivity influenced the scientific study of the mind for decades. It has taken over a full century, not a quarter of one, to find our way back to James's vision of a science of mental life that integrates experimental psychology, brain science, and phenomenology. In recent years, a growing number of cognitive scientists have come to accept that there cannot be a complete science of the mind without understanding subjectivity and consciousness, and that cognitive science will accordingly need to make systematic use of introspective first-person reports about subjective experience. As the cognitive neuroscientist Chris Frith recently stated, a major program for 21st century science will be to discover how an experience can be translated into a report, thus enabling our experiences to be shared. Yet this renewed appreciation of subjective experience raises the question of how to obtain precise phenomenological data. Francisco was especially concerned with this question in his research on the neurodynamics of mental states. His proposal was that cognitive science needs to incorporate first-person methods of exploring experience. First-person methods increase an individual's sensitivity to his or her own experience through the systematic training of attention and self-regulation of emotion. Francisco thought that first-person methods were important for cognitive neuroscience for several reasons. First, they help subjects gain access to aspects of their experience that would otherwise remain unnoticed, such as transient affective state or quality of attention. Second, the refined first-person reports subjects thereby produce can help the experimenter to understand physiological processes that would otherwise remain opaque, such as the variability in brain dynamics as seen in neuroimaging experiments. Francisco called this approach neuro-phenomenology. He demonstrated its fruitfulness in one of his last experimental studies, guiding the study of brain dynamics by using first-person data. In this study, first-person methods were used to reveal important phenomenological differences in the subjective quality of attention during visual perception, and these differences were shown to be correlated with distinct frequency and phase synchrony patterns in the large-scale dynamics of brain activity on a millisecond timescale. There is another reason Francisco thought first-person methods are important. Individuals who can generate specific sorts of mental states and report on those states with a high degree of phenomenological precision provide a route into studying the causal efficacy of mental processes, considered neurodynamically as global or large-scale processes that can modify local and specific neural and somatic events. Francisco believed that reintroducing the causal efficacy of the mental in this way was theoretically and experimentally more fruitful than the standard neural correlates framework, and he developed these ideas in his pioneering research on the neurodynamics of epilepsy and strategies for the first-person cognitive control of epileptic seizures. It is worth reconsidering from this vantage point of first-person methods why psychology rejected introspection long ago. According to the standard history, introspection was given a fair try, but failed. It failed allegedly because the two rival schools of introspectionist psychology were unable to agree whether there was such a thing as imageless thought. James had already observed, however, that the form of introspection practiced by these schools was stilted and tedious because it focused on the sensations caused by impoverished sensory stimuli. It is not surprising that introspection of this sort turned out to be so unilluminating, as Gestalt psychologists and phenomenologists also later pointed out. Furthermore, the textbook history neglects to mention that the rival schools did agree with each other at the descriptive level of introspective phenomenology. Their disagreement was at the level of theoretical interpretation. One lesson to be learned from this debate, therefore, is not that introspection is a useless method for obtaining descriptive data about subjective experience, but that psychology needs to discriminate carefully between the description of subjective phenomena and causal explanatory theorizing. A similar lesson could be drawn from the famous studies of Nisbet and Wilson in 1977. They observed that subjects often said their behavior was caused by mental events when it was really the result of external manipulation. Yet these inaccurate subjective reports were causal explanatory in form, not purely descriptive and phenomenological. Again, the lesson to be learned is that subjects should be coached to pay strict attention to their felt cognitive processes and to avoid causal explanatory conjectures. Yet, how is such attention to be cultivated? Francisco saw first-person methods as concerned with precisely this question. He thought that Buddhist practices of contemplative mental discipline are exemplary because of their pragmatic refinement and theoretical sophistication. Whereas James described introspection as simply the looking into our own minds and reporting what we there discover, Buddhism speaks of sustained voluntary attention to one's own mental processes. Buddhist phenomenology distinguishes between attentional stability and instability due to mental excitation, and between attentional vividness and dullness due to mental laxity. Buddhist phenomenology also discusses the metacognitive monitoring of these qualities of attention, and Buddhist epistemology discusses the degree to which a mental cognition ascertains or fails to ascertain its mental object. According to this perspective, if the stream of thought and feeling is limpid rather than turbulent and murky, then introspection in James's sense will be much richer in its discoveries and reports. Francisco's vision, I said at the outset, was not that Buddhist contemplatives could become new experimental subjects for research on the neural correlates of consciousness, but rather that they could become a new kind of scientific collaborator or partner. Cognitive science has so far explored only one small corner of the human mind, the one accessible to phenomenologically naive subjects reporting to phenomenologically naive cognitive scientists. The encounter between Buddhism and cognitive science raises another prospect, the prospect of subjects with a high degree of phenomenological expertise reporting to phenomenologically informed cognitive scientists. Francisco's vision, in its boldest and most provocative form, was that future cognitive neuroscientists would be trained in contemplative phenomenology, as well as brain imaging techniques and mathematical modeling. At the same time, contemplative phenomenologists would be knowledgeable in neuroscience and experimental psychology. The two perspectives would mutually constrain and enrich each other and would hybridize into the rich science of mental life James originally envisioned. Francisco's hope for this meeting, I believe, was that it could be a first step on this path. Thank you. Undo me? Actually, just okay.
We asked Evan to give this talk to, in a sense, frame some of the bigger methodological and philosophical issues that are going to be informing all of the sessions, all of the focus sessions to come. We're not going to be actually taking questions or discussing this talk now, but we will be bringing Evan back on stage in the final integrative session, where we'll have a chance to give him an opportunity to put some of the discussions that have gone on in the previous sessions into some of these bigger philosophical and methodological frameworks. Let me tell you what's going to happen now and what you as the audience are about to see. What the Mind and Life Institute has learned over some 15 or more years of conducting small meetings in the living room of His Holiness in Dharamsala, India, is that while you have to have these presentations to give people something to respond to, the pay dirt in situations like these almost always comes out of the dialogue, out of the unscripted exchanges, out of the online sudden insights. So we've tried to design the format of this meeting as much as possible to maximize opportunities for exchanges like this. More specifically, what we've actually tried to do is to create a setting on stage that has something of the flavor of a meeting in the living room of His Holiness in India. The chairs aren't quite as comfortable, and you aren't going to get the tea and cookie breaks. But as you'll see, the seating is such that the Buddhist scholars and the scientists are partly facing each other, so it becomes easier for them to make eye contact and to directly talk with one another. We even have a kind of visual metaphor going on here, whereby the scientists are on one side and the Buddhist scholars are on the other side on a level playing field, speaking as equals. With a couple of exceptions, the speakers are also going to be presenting from their seats, not from up here on the podium where I'm standing. And this is being done so that they remain in a setting that will be most enabling of spontaneous engagement with their colleagues, even during the talks, and also will enable His Holiness to interrupt and to ask questions even during the talks if he needs to, which will be more difficult if the speaker were up here with his back partly turned away from His Holiness and the others. So what's going to happen in the next 3 sessions is that we're going to have 2 paired speakers, a scientist and a Buddhist scholar, who each is going to speak for about 20 minutes. In some sessions, the Buddhist scholar is going to go first. In other sessions, the scientist will go first. It will sort of depend on what the session organizers felt would be intellectually most fruitful. The function of the paired talks, above all, is to put a lot of questions on the table. And His Holiness is going to be given the first opportunity to speak to some of those questions. After that, we're going to open up the conversation further to our distinguished panelists in a more or less free-flowing way. You might notice that occasionally we have to briefly stop the action to clarify some concept or word or claim that isn't translating easily for His Holiness, although his English is very good. Inadvertently, and also the scientists have been urged and trained and cajoled to avoid jargon. Inadvertently, sometimes jargon might slip in, and we'll need to just stop, clarify. And actually, these can be quite interesting moments, because sometimes something that appears to be simply a matter of linguistic difficulty ends up revealing itself to be a deeper matter of cultural or philosophical difference that can be then exposed and be quite fruitful to discuss. You are being invited to bear witness to all of this, but we also want to involve you as best we can. So to do this, what we are going to do in every session is about 40 minutes before the end, we are going to begin taking your questions. Because this is such a big audience, we decided it would be too cumbersome to try to work with an open mic. So instead, what we're going to do is ask you to write your questions down on note cards, on index cards. It may even be, and I'm not sure about this, that the index cards were available when you entered, and so you actually have them in your possession. You're to pass them down to the aisles where ushers will pick them up, And about the right time, someone will bring them up onto stage to one of the, whoever is not moderating in the main at that moment. The other moderator will be given the questions, and we will try to take as many of them as we can. In the final session, we're going to have 3 focus sessions that follow this format: attention, imagery, and emotion. In the final session, tomorrow afternoon, we're going to shift gears again and try still to draw you in still more fully into the proceedings. The speakers are going to return to the speakers in that session are going to return to the podium to share some reflections on what they think this has been all about, how successful they think they've been, what they see as the main challenges and opportunities here. And at the very end, His Holiness will return to the podium again to speak again with you directly. And we'll say more about how all that will work at the start of that final session, but I think the priority now is to get started. And moderating the first session on attention is my colleague, Arthur Zients. Arthur?
Thank you, Anne. Is my mic up? Let me begin first by mentioning that normally when His Holiness enters in Dharamsala, we spend a certain amount of time in greeting. And that warmth of exchange is always an intimate and special part of our gatherings. We did this already downstairs, so we won't do this now. But I would like, for the benefit of the audience, to introduce our scientists and Buddhist scholars. To my right, to your left, is Jonathan Cohen, who is a professor of psychology at Princeton University and also director for the Center for Brain, Mind, and Behavior. To his right is Anne Treisman, who's a professor of psychology at Princeton University. Further on is David Meyer, who is a professor of psychology from the University of Michigan. And finally, amongst the scientists is Nancy Kanwisher, who's professor of brain and cognitive science at MIT and at the McGovern Institute. On the Buddhist scholar side, we have Alan Wallace, who is the president and founder of the Santa Barbara Institute. You already know Anne. She is not on the Buddhist side, but she is simply over there on that side. Then we have Ajahn Amaro, who is co-abbot of the Abhayagiri Monastery. And then finally, interpreting for His Holiness the Dalai Lama, we have Tunshin Jimpa, who himself is a scholar with a Geshe degree and PhD from the University in Cambridge and the director of the Institute of Tibetan Classics. We'll begin with Jonathan Cohen speaking to the nature of attention and cognitive control.
Thank you, Al. So first, let me start by thanking you very much and saying how honored and how much of a pleasure it is to be here, both on my own behalf and also on the behalf of my scientific colleagues. I also want to thank Your Holiness and also Evan, wherever he disappeared to, for having really beautifully framed the kinds of questions and the kind of dialogue that we want to have. And I think now what we'd like to do is begin to engage in that. And we had a lot of discussion in pre-meetings as to which of the 3 topics should go first, because each seemed to carry a great amount of importance and a lot of interest and generate a lot of enthusiasm. And in the end, I think it was kind of arbitrary. But such as it is, the rationale for going first with attention and cognitive control is because it seems that that plays a central role in Buddhist practice and in Buddhist philosophy. And of course, it's a topic that's of great interest in modern psychology. So what I'm going to do is try and outline some of the things that we have learned about attention using scientific methodology, but maybe more importantly, some of the limitations in what we have come to learn, with a hope that that will be one of the points of complementarity that we can explore in our dialogue with you, the Buddhist scholars. Perhaps the most important place to start, I think, as Anne pointed out in her comments, is with some definitions. If we're going to have a dialogue between not only different cultures, but in some cases, well, in this case, of course, different languages, then it's really important that we do our best anyway to try and define what we mean. Now, I can say that from the scientific side, this has been a problem just among the scientists to agree what we mean by attention and cognitive control. So the definitions, can we have the, great. The definitions that I'm going to put up are ones that are really a starting point for discussion, and I don't think should be taken too rigidly. But I think they capture much of the consensus of what scientists today think about attention and cognitive control. By attention, we typically mean the capacity to selectively process information that's available to us. That could be sensory information, bodily feelings or thoughts, memories, and even actions. People talk about attention to action. By cognitive control, and much of many of the comments I'm going to offer have to do with the relationship of attention to control. But insofar as we can talk about control as something different than attention, then what we mean by that is the capacity to guide thought and behavior in accord with intention. So it's an internal directing of behavior. Often most evident when you have to override a habitual or reflexive response. And my favorite example of that is to choose not to scratch a mosquito bite. It's very compelling to want to scratch a mosquito bite, and often if we're distracted, we'll find ourselves doing it. And yet we have the capability to not do that. And of course, the purpose of control is to pursue strategies and goals. So we think that one of the reasons that there are these attentional mechanisms in the brain or in the mind is because there's so much information in the environment that our minds can't apprehend it and process it all. And as an example, and I have a few examples that we often use in the laboratory to study this, here is one that I think illustrates the limitations in our ability to process information and why attention is so important. So what I have here So here's an example that I think illustrates that. What I'm going to do is put up a set of pictures. There are going to be flashing pictures here. And it's going to change. And the question is whether or not how quickly we can detect the change. So I'm going to ask Your Holiness whether you see what's changing. It's a very difficult task. And most people, let me say, have a very hard time finding what's changing in the picture. So let me point out. Right here, many people in the audience, I suspect, most people, are now recognizing that the reflection is coming and going. And it's just remarkable, once you see it, that it's almost impossible not to see. And yet, it's so hard to notice it first. And what that illustrates for us is I think, is that we have a very focused attention. So that illustrates what we refer to as the limited capacity of attention, that it's difficult to attend to many sources of information at once, or even many parts of the same source of information. And similarly, it's difficult to perform many control-demanding tasks at once. So for example, when you're first learning to ride a bike or first learning to drive a car, you don't want somebody talking to you in the passenger seat, right? Perhaps after you've gotten better at it, it's okay, you can have the discussion. But when you're first learning, you want to focus your attention. It's very hard to do two things at once. Another point that I think has come out of our research is that there is a continuum of the need for attention and control. So as I've just said, when you're first learning to ride a bike or drive a car, it requires a lot of attention. But over time, that task, as you've gained experience and practice, doesn't require attention. You can drive the car almost without thinking about it. And so this raises a question: how are attention and control related to one another? And this has been one of, I think, the central questions of psychological research in this area. And there are two answers to that question. They're the same, or they're different. And so I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what they have in common, and suggest to some people that they may be the same thing. The view that those who think of these as the same thing, the view that people that believe that take, is that essentially attention is what control does. So control operates by representing the goal of a behavior, what it is you're trying to accomplish, and then that oversees the process responsible for performing the particular task to achieve the goal, and that's done by selecting appropriate stimuli and then the actions that correspond to those stimuli. So it's selecting out the right things to process and then what you want to do with those. And the observable effects of this interaction are what we call attention. So how can we study this in the laboratory? Well, I've provided one example, and I'd like to do a couple of others. Here's one that engages spatial attention, the ability to locate objects in a particular part of space. So we're going to start with a very simple task, which is to locate, in this case, I'm going to put up a bunch of lines on the screen, and I'm going to ask people to look for the horizontal line. Of course, the audience can participate here as well. So where's the horizontal line? Yeah, it's simple, right? It pops right out at you. So similarly, if I ask you to find the red line among a bunch of green images, it pops right out. And it's almost as if that didn't require attention. You had to kind of look at the stimulus, but the stimulus itself pops out, or the target itself pops out. However, now, if I ask you to look for the horizontal red line, that is the one that's both horizontal and red, it's much harder, right? More or less the same display, but now we find that we have to scan almost sequentially. And so now attention is engaged, and you have to control that attention, looking around until you actually find the target that one is looking for. And so this gives us an opportunity to test what circumstances engage attention and which ones don't, and we can measure, for example, how many distractors it takes, or how much longer it takes to look for a target based on how many distractors there are. And we can measure those attentional demands. This is work, for example, that Ann Treisman on our panel has pioneered. These are examples of attention directed to the location of an object, but we can also direct attention to particular features of a single object. So in this example, what I'd like you to do, and this is one specifically for the Tibetan scholars here, I would like you to name the color of the stimulus. What color is it displayed in? Okay, it doesn't matter what the stimulus is. What color is it? So for the rest of you, let me show you what I showed His Holiness. And here is an example where you can pick the color, but it's very hard to ignore the word. Did you find it hard to ignore the word? Yes. Yeah. So that is one of my favorite examples, because it both illustrates your ability to attend to, in this case, as I've said, one dimension of the stimulus, and yet the difficulty sometimes we have in making that attention complete, and in really exclusively processing the thing that we want without getting interference from other sources of information. This is a test called the Stroop test, after the researcher who first discovered it, or described this, I guess about 70 years ago now. And here's, this test has been used perhaps more than any other in the psychological laboratory to study attention. And among the many findings that have been observed is that people are much slower to name the color when the word disagrees with the color in the conflicting condition, where the word says green, but the color is red, than, for example, if the word and the color are the same. If I were to have printed red in red, then of course it's much easier. Right. And what's particularly interesting about this and many of these tasks is that when attention is engaged in this sort of focal way, it appears that there's a part of the brain or a region of the brain that is particularly active, and that's the prefrontal cortex, the front part of the brain. And this is an observation that we've seen in many different contexts, in this sort of task, but in others as well. For example, when attention or control is needed to override emotions. For example, studies have been done in which subjects have been given moral dilemmas, in which there's a conflict between emotion and rational thought or cognition. One example, a poignant example, but I think a telling one, is one in which you imagine yourself in a town that's being attacked by enemy soldiers. And the townspeople all decide to hide, you're one of them, and everybody has to be very quiet so that the soldiers don't find you, because if they find you, they're going to kill everybody, okay? And all of a sudden, the baby begins to cry. And what do you do? Is it okay for the mother to cover the baby and possibly risk smothering it by suffocating it in order to save all the people in the town? Now, of course, this is a horrible situation. Nobody would want to be in it. But presented with that, what is one to do? And what we found is that people who have an emotional response and say, I just could not kill the baby, it's just too precious a life, get emotional areas in the brain activated. We can see areas of the brain that are associated with emotion become activated. Other people who say, well, later will tell you it's a horrible thing, of course, they're aware of that, but in the end decide that to save the many more lives, it's acceptable. In effect, overcoming that emotion show greater activity of the same region of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, as if that area is able to override and control the emotional response that leads to a different behavior. And we see the same sort of thing in economic decision-making, just to pick another example. If somebody were to offer us a large sum of money, maybe $100, and we were going to split it, but they gave me the job of making the decision as to how to split it, and I offered you a penny, and I decided to keep $99.99, you might very naturally be offended by that and be angry and reject the offer and say, forget it. And what we see when people are in the scanner and are presented with this and reject the offer is, again, areas of the brain that are related to emotions activated. Some people, though, decide that penny is better than nothing, and those people show greater activity in the prefrontal cortex. So again, illustrating an example where one part of the mind, presumably associated with control, can overcome the emotional response and lead to what some might argue is a more rational behavior. So these observations suggest that control and attention are very closely related. Control leads to the focusing of attention or on sensory phenomena or actions that lead to a particular behavior. But there are certainly observations that also suggest that they might be different, and that control, internal control, reflects one source of attention, maybe voluntary attention, but that there are others. So for example, sudden stimuli can capture attention without any intention, without any voluntary desire to be attending to that stimulus. And so that suggests that there might be some differentiation between attention and control, and that attention might be thought of as the selective effect of whatever is currently guiding thought. Now, this might be a goal or intention, that is, it might come from internal control, or it might be something else. It might be a stimulus, a memory, or a particularly powerful emotion. And in that case, it might not be under the same sort of internal control as in other circumstances. So that suggests that maybe there is a difference between attention in general and control of the internal sort that I think we share an interest in. So what I want to do in the few minutes that remain then is just identify a few topics for discussion that I think are particularly germane to this dialogue, that build on some of the background that I've just tried to provide. Maybe the first and most interesting question is one that I've already hinted at, which is, are attention and control unitary mechanisms? That is there one attention, a single mechanism? Is the same mechanism used
강전진이 대니니부터 쉐베다 심중소로 쉐베는 찌그라 찌그라 지라바 찌는 문제 지고래 양한테 코지 독서수수는 샤고요 없이 대외로 가지지리야 독서수수는 샤고요 없이 상당한
So is the same mechanism used, for example, to pay attention to the color of a stimulus, or to find the location of a stimulus, or to control an emotion, or are those different sorts of things? And at least much psychological research suggests that they may be different. And so this is, I think, something that will be very interesting to explore. The other possibility The other possibility is that there's a family of mechanisms. Now, maybe this family of mechanisms shares some things in common, but other things are different. And if some of the things are different from one form of attention or control to another, what are those? How do they differ? And of course, of interest to us is which are the ones that are most relevant to Buddhist practice and about which we can learn the most from discussions with you. Another question is, and for the next couple of slides, I will assume that there's at least one form of attention so that I can refer to it more simply rather than constantly referring to the many. But perhaps if there are many, about each we can ask, what's the breadth? How focused or broad is attention? So for example, in this display, I can ask you to tell me what are the small little letters or what is the big letter that they all make. So you can look at specific features or spatially localized, maybe even single sensory channels, or you can distribute your attention over the whole scene and get the gist of a scene, spatially distribute your attention. If that's given this range of scope or breadth of attention, is it the same mechanism involved in focused as in broad, or are those different? So we can ask the same question again. Is there one mechanism or several? This is a question that came out of our previous discussions. What are the timing characteristics? So from our perspective in measurements that are made in the laboratory, it seems that it takes a percept maybe 50 to 100 milliseconds of stability to be able to command attention. And yet in discussions with Alan and some of the other Buddhist scholars, it seems that Buddhism holds that there is maybe one event per millisecond to which one can attend, and that suggests a much faster time scale.
attention to do it so imradi na ta ko charida dadan mera chambucha kores chari bungan ta bena 50 to 100 milliseconds chikuye so those.
I think a particularly germane issue is going to be the nature of selective versus sustained attention. This is something that psychology was interested This is something that psychology, in its initial explorations of attention, was very interested in the enduring capability of attention. How vigilant could you remain? But over the past 10 or 20 years, the focus has shifted to the selective aspects of attention that we talked about earlier, and has not attended as much to the capabilities of enduring attention. And I think this is some place where we really can learn a lot as well. Again, there's a difference between the way we think about the relationship between attention and effort and what we've heard from the Buddhist scholars. We tend to think of attention as effortful. So it's very hard to maintain a selective attention or to endure attention. And yet in Buddhism, it appears that at least after initial training, the focusing of attention seems to be an effortless and almost relaxing process. And this is, I think, of great interest to us. This maybe is the most important question in my view. Can attention and control be learned? This is, certainly it's the case, as I said earlier, that we spent a lot of research time studying how when you learn how to do a skill, it can reduce its reliance on attention. However, very little research has gone on about learning how to control attention itself. And obviously, this is a central feature of Buddhist practice, and so I think is going to be a very profitable topic for discussion. And this is the last topic that I wanted to mention. It pertains to phenomena that have long been recognized in Western science, but that have remained at the fringes of study, placebo and hypnosis. And we think of these as examples of heightened expectations or selective attention. So placebo is if a doctor tells you that a medicine is going to help you, even if it's sugar, it turns out because you believe it's going to help you, it can help you. And so that's an example how a belief or an expectation can lead to a change in your experience and maybe even a bodily change just on the basis of that belief. And similarly with hypnosis, it's an example of where focused attention can lead to unusual abilities. But in both cases, there are examples where this ability to focus attention or control comes from the outside, the doctor or the hypnotist. And what I think would be interesting to explore is how does this relate to the form of heightened control that the Buddhist can achieve only under internal direction? So with that as a background from the Western scientific side, I'd like to now hand the chair over, literally, to Alan, who will provide us with a perspective from the Buddhist side.
Good morning. I offer that as both a greeting as well as a declaration. I've been asked to do two things this morning. One is to give a presentation from the Buddhist perspective on ways of training the attention, the nature of attention, plasticity of attention. So that will be one, hopefully, coherent discussion. But I was asked to do something in addition to that, and I'll try to keep it very concise because I'm eagerly anticipating our panel discussion, and I want to erode as little from that as possible. But what I was asked to do is to present some of the salient contrasting perspectives between the Buddhist and the scientific ways of studying the mind, the assumptions that are brought in, the working hypotheses that carry through. So I will try to be concise in both cases so we can get on with the panel. To first of all set this within a very brief context of Western psychology, I will allude to this quote that Evan Thompson has already brought to our attention by the great American pioneer of psychology, William James. William James set forth a threefold strategy for studying the mind. Said it should carry on along three avenues of studying behavior. By way of behavior, studying the mental correlates, studying the brain by way of neural correlates, studying the mind, and finally, of course, looking at mental phenomena themselves. Direct observation, direct experimentation, direct investigation, for which the term we use is introspective observation. And he said among these three, the neural, the behavioral, and the introspective, this famous quote, introspective observation is what we have to rely on first and foremost and always. So he had no fear of being redundant there. He was making his point. William James also wrote brilliantly on the topic of what he called, well, attention generally, and what he called sustained voluntary attention. He was a very broad-ranging thinker, was deeply concerned with a wide variety of topics in philosophy, education, and so forth. And he addressed the issue of the relevance of attention, the possibility of controlling attention, to the overall educational process in the broadest sense of the term. In this regard, he comments, the faculty of voluntarily bringing back a wandering attention over and over again is the very root of judgment, character, and will. An education which should improve this faculty would be the education par excellence. But it is easier to define this ideal than to give practical instructions for bringing it about. William James thought that the control of the attention was of paramount importance in terms of making ethical decisions. It also of tremendous importance in terms of determining what we actually experience as our Lebenswelt, as our world of experience, our perceptual experience. What we attend to, he said, for the moment, what we attend to is our reality. Training the attention, gaining control of attention, he saw as being a very important issue. We see here in this quote, at the same time he more or less throws up his hands. It's a great ideal. How on earth do you go about doing it? His tentative conclusion was rather dismal, that some people are probably simply born scatterbrained and remain such, while other people are born and remain collected and remain such. It's more or less like your height. There's not a whole lot you can do about it. And so we leave, because since the time of James, we have seen tremendous, wonderful progress in the behavioral sciences, extraordinary progress in the neurosciences, in terms of progress, in terms of the introspective study of the mind. I think we have more or less stayed at a standstill. If one looks at the alleged outbreak of ADHD, perhaps we are actually going retrograde. We move then on to Buddhism, which, as His Holiness commented this morning, has had a central interest in the nature of the mind. And long before the Buddha, perhaps something like 500 years before the Buddha, there were already extraordinary advances made in terms of refining the attention, focusing the attention, gaining cognitive control of attention. And the Buddha was a recipient of this preceding tradition of training the attention. He himself applied such training, and he incorporated it into his training, and that has remained a central feature of Buddhist contemplative practice ever since. But to provide a very brief context, Buddhist practice is not equivalent to training the attention. There's a much broader context for the Buddhist study of the mind as well as Buddhist spiritual practice altogether. The foundation of Buddhist practice is ethics. Without ethics, you simply have no viable spiritual practice at all. And the Buddhists will say this is a universal declaration. It is not confined to Buddhism. It is not a sectarian issue. It's just the way things are. But it's not simply a dogmatic assertion. That is an ethical way of life, a way of life that is oriented towards not injuring others, orienting towards being of service where one can, living a life based upon compassion, empathy, altruism. Such a life turns out, pragmatically speaking, to be an indispensable foundation for balancing the mind, for cultivating attentional balance, refining the attention, for cultivating emotional balance, for cultivating cognitive balance, clearly seeing what is being presented to our senses without a cognitive deficit, without cognitive hyperactivity of superimposing things that simply are not there. So ethics is the foundation. Upon that basis, upon that indispensable basis, then there is a great deal of psychological training. Especially the issue of balance is crucial, of the attention, the emotions, the cognition. Honing the mind, balancing the mind, and upon that basis, then you go for what is literally the cutting edge of Buddhist inquiry. With a balanced mind, then one investigates into the nature of, frankly, all manner of phenomena, with a primary emphasis on subjective mental states. Then, objective physical phenomena, the world around us, by way of the senses. And then finally, Buddhism, the Buddhist tradition, is crucially concerned with the relationship between the outer and the inner. In what way does the phenomenal world relate to the consciousness that is aware of it? Now, as Jonathan mentioned earlier this morning, we need to make sure that we're more or less talking about the same things. And so, obviously, Tibetans don't natively speak English, nor did their predecessors in India. The Sanskrit term that we are translating as attention is manaskara, or yidachapa in Tibetan. And a definition taken from my own training in the Tibetan Buddhist monastic tradition is that attention is indeed a distinct mental factor. And it has specific functions, namely it directs awareness and other mental processes to an object. That is, not only awareness, but in the Buddhist understanding, there may be multiple concomitant or simultaneous mental processes that are working together focused on the same object. So I may be looking to a specific object, but looking at it with great admiration, maybe great desire, maybe great expectation, and so a number of factors will be coming in, and attention is corralling all of them, focusing all on the same object. Awareness, but also the other concomitant mental processes conjoined with awareness. And it is attention that enables us actually to apprehend the object, to know it is there. When Indian contemplatives, even before the Buddha, and then 2,500 years of Buddhist contemplatives have attended to the issue of attention, one of the first things that they, and I think we can also discover, is that our attention is impaired. That is, it's very difficult to manage sustained voluntary attention with a high degree of clarity. So we go back only about halfway through the Buddhist tradition, back to the 8th century of the Common Era, one of the most renowned of Indian Buddhist sages who actually studied and eventually taught briefly at this great monastic university called Nalanda, to which His Holiness alluded earlier, an extraordinary university, a student body of 10,000. Its central library was 11 stories high. It was a central area of education for all of Asia. And it was in northern India, and many of the greatest Buddhist pundits studied there, taught there. Shantideva was among them. And he comments on one of the consequences of impaired attention in its classic text, The Guide to the Bodhisattva Way of Life, in which he states, one should stabilize the mind in meditative concentration, or samadhi. For a person whose mind is distracted lives between the fangs of mental afflictions. What he's stating here in short is that insofar as our minds are prone to excitation, distraction, they're out of control, suggesting from a Buddhist perspective, attention and cognitive control are not the same, because the attention is often utterly out of control. To that extent, we are extremely vulnerable to mental afflictions such as anger, craving, envy, a myriad of other mental tendencies that can drive us crazy, or at least give us a lot of suffering. It lowers our immune system. It makes us more vulnerable to the sources of unhappiness within. We move 7 centuries ahead, to now one of the greatest scholars, greatest contemplatives of the entire Tibetan Buddhist tradition, 15th century, also a great scholar, and the Tibetans themselves established monastic universities inspired by the earlier ones in India. And Tsongkhapa, in his presentation on a classic, really a definitive presentation on ways of training the attention, illustrates its relevance for studying the mind and actually all other types of phenomena. And I quote simply, he says it better than I could. He said, in order to examine, gives an analogy, in order to examine a wall tapestry in a dark room, if you illuminate it with a radiant, steady lamp, you can vividly examine the images in the tapestry. But if the lamp is either dim, or even if it is bright, flickers due to wind, your observation will be impaired. Likewise, in order to fathom the nature of any phenomenon with penetrating intelligence, supported by unwavering, sustained, voluntary attention, you can clearly observe the real nature of the phenomenon under investigation. Buddhism has not developed, does not have access to this marvelous array of technology that's been developed over the last 400 years in modern science. but it has developed the mind, which after all is our sole access for immediately observing mental phenomena at all. Attention training is a crucial element of Buddhist meditative training. There are specific goals of such training. The first is relaxation. One proceeds in this practice with a sense of ease. It cannot be intensely, ambitiously bound up with desire and so forth. One can certainly exert too much effort. But now in terms of the very specific features of attention itself, one aspires to stability, a coherence, a continuity of attention upon one's chosen object. But it's not sufficient merely to be stable. There must be a sense of clarity, of vividness, of high resolution. So how do we go about cultivating these qualities of attention, which are bound to be useful in every conscious human endeavor, including the first-person investigation of the mind? Two faculties are cultivated. The first of these is mindfulness. We cultivate attention by way of arousing and sustaining mindfulness of our chosen object. Mindfulness is defined in this tradition as the ability to sustain voluntary attention continuously upon a familiar object without forgetfulness or distraction. The term mindfulness has a dual connotation of recollection. If we go back to William James very briefly, he said, when we maintain sustained voluntary attention, it's not just plunking down attention and making it stay, but actually it's a sequence of pulses of cognition, of remembering to remember, remembering to remember. And Buddhism has exactly the same connotation. But simply maintaining mindfulness may not be sufficient. Who's minding the store? And that is, if you're attending to something mindfully, how do you know whether or not you're really doing so, or whether in fact your mind has unconsciously wandered away or imploded into dullness, laxity, or maybe simply fallen asleep? So there has to be a guard, a guardian, a monitor, a quality control that is inspecting, at least intermittently, the quality of attention itself. We can call it meta-attention, and that is precisely our ability from moment to moment to monitor the quality of attention, specifically en garde, like a dualist, en garde, looking out for the occurrence of either excitation. This is the fragmentation, the distraction, the wandering of the mind, where the mind is being exploded, so to speak, or the mind is falling into laxity. The Tibetan word actually implies sinking, imploding, withdrawing into itself, losing clarity. So that is the task of meta-attention. Very briefly, I think we'll certainly come back to this in the panel discussion. What is the scope of attention? In the Buddhist understanding, the attention in a single moment, and we'll get to that later, what that really means, but in a single moment, it is said attention is highly selective. Whether it's voluntary or involuntary, it can be focused only in a single moment, which is of extremely brief duration, on any one of the five physical senses, or it can attend to the field of mental phenomena, to mental processes, which is considered the sixth domain of experience. As I can observe visual phenomena, so can I observe mental phenomena, such as emotions, thoughts, quality of attention, and so forth. So one engages in this practice of training the attention, and now we return to these three same qualities. What are signs that the quality of your attention is being enhanced? At the beginning of the training, the degree of effort is considerable. If you want to have it cushy and comfortable all the way, you probably have to find another line of work. A jacuzzi comes to mind. But to train the attention, certainly at the beginning, it is somewhat strenuous. It is bringing back, like William James said, again and again, this wandering mind. It takes effort, but as one progresses in the practice, the degree of effort subsides. You're seeing a graph that's going down over time. But the anomaly here is that as you're becoming more and more relaxed, you're not falling into torpor. You're not falling into a vaguely wandering mind, but in fact the quality of stability is being enhanced, which means in these momentary pulses of cognition, there is an increasing homogeneity of them, that a greater and greater density of them, or homogeneity of them, is focused on the same object. Which gives you then the impression I'm attending continually to this object because my attention is not bouncing around to a multitude of objects, which would then be experienced as excitation or fragmentation of attention. We have this sequence of moments of cognition in the Buddhist understanding on the order of 1,000 per second. As one enhances the vividness, the resolution, the clarity, the brilliance of attention, then one way of looking at this would be that you have a greater density of moments of apprehending cognition. Rather than they're standing idle, they're actually engaging with the object, so you're getting higher resolution over time. You're also getting higher resolution at any one moment of time, that is like a second, because you're seeing the details of the object that you have chosen. That, in short, is the nature of that attention training. What relevance could that have? That is my interpretation. His Holiness expressed some qualms there. I would say that last point about vividness and the density of moments of cognition, there's a horn coming in, right? That's exactly where I horned into the Buddhist tradition. This is this will open up for discussion later. The relevance of Buddhist studies Buddhist studies of attention for science, I think, are very considerable. If we go back to the study of celestial phenomena before Galileo, before Tycho Brahe, a lot of things simply could not be known about the stars, the planets, sun and moon. It needed the instrument. It needed, for example, a telescope, and so we see the science of astronomy was facilitated by this, developed before Galileo, refined by Galileo. That provided Galileo and those who followed him with a platform of stable, vivid observation of celestial phenomena, without which you'll simply never know whether Jupiter has moons, and so forth. You need to look at the phenomena themselves in a stable, precise, highly illuminated fashion. If that is true for celestial phenomena, if that is true for all other phenomena that are studied scientifically, look at the phenomena, not just other phenomena that are correlated with the phenomena you're interested in, then I think it stands to reason this is true of the mind as well. But it's not enough to bring in folk psychology or simply undergraduates, giving them $10 an hour to look at their minds, and then base all of your behavioral and neuroscientific studies upon the data provided by these undergraduates, but rather increase the level of sophistication of first-person observation to start to be a suitable complement, a suitable partner for the marvelous sophistication we have in the behavioral and neurological sciences or neurosciences. So the science of mind likewise requires the development of something comparable to or analogous to a telescope, namely refined attention, allowing for stable and vivid observations of mental phenomena, exactly as Tsongkhapa pointed out 500 years ago. 1 minute. We will move now quickly. Relevance of scientific studies for Buddhism, there are many. How, among the wide range of Buddhist techniques, how do you apply these to the Buddhist psyche where we are so different from Tibetans, either now 500 years ago or Indians living 1,500 years ago? What works? If you've developed attention, if that is possible, to what extent can this be transferred to other tasks that were not your initial task when training the attention? If you develop attention, how durable is it? If you've been doing this in a meditation hut for 6 months, 6 years, does that carry over in time? And what are the behavioral and neurocorrelates? For society at large, what is the potential for collaboration here? Understanding and facilitating mental health. Its relevance of training the attention for education, optimal performance in all human endeavors. The prevention and treatment possibly of attention disorders. This is an open area of investigation. It's not as if Buddhism has all the answers by any means, but maybe some storehouse to draw from. In summary here, it appears to me, as Jonathan was already suggesting, there is a complementarity between the Buddhist and the scientific ways of investigating the mind. The forte of Buddhism is certainly the first person, that is, entails its first person methods for directly studying the mind by way of investigating mental phenomena, doing so rigorously by means of trained attention, and in a complementary fashion, the forte of science is the third person, entails the third person methods for indirectly studying the mind, but by the very rigorous and sophisticated investigation of neural and behavioral correlates of mental phenomena. There was a match waiting to be made, in heaven or at MIT. Maybe there's not much difference. I think that is it. There is the ideal, the sophistication, engagement of these. Combination fulfilling William James's vision, but perhaps the vision of many other people as well.
Thank you very much, Alan. I'd like to thank all. We're going to be going till 11:15. We have actually very little time because of all the introductions. Questions can be passed to the aisles and picked up. We probably will only get to one or two today. We will be picking them up. We can maybe feed them in later on. What we'd like to do now is to pick up some of these questions that have been raised. Remember Jonathan's questions concerning whether attention can be trained, selective versus sustained attention, focused or broad, and so forth. Alan has also looked for opportunities for collaboration. As we said, we'd like to begin with the opportunity, giving the opportunity to His Holiness to direct his own response to one or another of these questions first, and then we'll be turning to our scientific and Buddhist colleague as well. Your Holiness, do you have something you'd like to add at this point?
Umma journal the sars community and doesn't need journalia and the you train to an shebadi and a you number chini yoba didn't she jinzing sheba number sungzin tanya bas jishe tabana you when taban together the room then the for the you the room mongu 찍마다 가서 신문도 와. 도나치서 찍셔도 와. 원부시버 콜라 뒤 찾아나요. 뒤나네 미국대에서 지나고 감주도 와. 그래서 두 스텝에 있는 순진님이 벌써야 된다고 소통한 게. 나소님이 봐. 유기 남바 나소 시작이야. 이네 진진이로 뒤 찍마도 유티 장량기 시바 민주화. 다양한 공간 찾아봤을니 다 유기 나바디 찍 진진식으로 뒤에 찍으시네 다 안다 되게 드셔야지 수달 때는 같이 통한 게 나소님이 보세요 유 나소 시켜야 돼 원부 시바를 유 나소 시켜야 돼 다 디나네 그 지라고 찍리야 다 그게 로로 떼야 돼 아니 로 찍지 세상 나소 yun naso shebadi naso be that tumomaimba korchik.
Jonathan, when you were making your presentation and defining what attention is in relation to cognitive control and particularly demonstrating some of your points through the slides where there were some experiments on how fast one can pay attention to specific features within a visual stimuli. It reminded me of certain discussions that we find in some of the classical Buddhist texts, particularly in relation to the discussions about how does perception arise, and are there multiplicity of perceptions in relation to a stimuli. And there's a lot of discussions of that in some of the Buddhist texts. And in fact, there were three different standpoints on this, and which has some parallel to the discussion of the attention. Because the fact is, when you are visually confronted with an object, with a stimuli, the visual experience itself is very rich. So far as the sensory faculty is concerned, it comes face to face with the stimuli. However, when we pay attention to the object, we can do so selectively. However, there has been a lot of discussion in the Buddhist epistemology as to when perceptions arise, within the visual stimuli there will be many different, say for example, a range of color combinations. So in relation to all these different colors, will there be different perceptions occurring simultaneously? Or will the perception be something like kind of a mirroring of what is out there? So that in a sense, and this is in fact given the term a splitting of egg into half. So you have the stimuli on the one side, and the perception is like the other half of the egg. So it's like a kind of a mirroring. However, there is another standpoint which maintains that regardless of the diversity and the richness of the stimuli, when it comes to the attention, there will only be one instance of perception that occurs. So when we look at some of the experiments that were done, which suggest greater attention for selection, greater selection in our attention, the third position seems to be closer to what you are suggesting.
다 달라야 그게 그래 그게 다 치료스님도 다 가다 유지 나바티 그 전체도 그게 샤 신변네 그 다 온부시발에 샤 신변네 그게 똑같이 다디 똑같이 가라 유디 뭐서도 저기야 말이야 유디가 나바샤는 거야 다고 계신 것이 온대 그러다 그래서 다다한다 또미 쉐바디기 유한다 나한테바디 거길이야 그 거길이야 계신 나마디게 장샤베 똑같이면 똑같이면 뭐 하도 칼리한 건 아주 유디 낭 신배 물리야 똑발이야 튼지나바디 쉐기버서 수도가 그래도 그 똑같은 쟁에게 공부시바디 계신 나마신 가사르시 그래서 공부시바를 셔루디야 아다 되기가 다 저기 송지 당년배 야르지 협시를 예배서시 공부시바가 셔비네 단디 다 공부시바디 그게 유틸이야 떠버지야 야 일시바지 폐지 용면로 아데 일시바디 가래 군둥에 잡아래 군두 잡아 그래서 셔바 타다 려 셔바 타다 걸려 로디 걸어 자자 가면 공부시바 텔레 그 유틸이야 떠버지게 선다 일시바 공부시바 콜기 일시바 직 공부시바 디 장배 다 도미시바 디 장배 도버들이야 아니야 그 일시는 직
However, from the Buddhist point of view, if we look at the experiments that you showed, a lot of these seems to suggest a level of attention which from the Buddhist point of view would be really understood in the domain of thought. It's not really a sensory experience because the moment you involve cognitive control or some form of selection, you're already at the level of thought. So from the Buddhist point of view, we understand what is occurring, this phenomena, in a very complex way. So you have the initial instance of visual experience, which is a sensory level of experience. And then when you direct your attention to that visual. So when you are at the level of pure sensory experience, there is no judgments involved, no evaluative judgments, nor any discriminations of characteristics and so on. So it's only at the level of thought when the selection occurs that the attention comes into the picture. So that attention is not really part of the visual experience from the Buddhist point of view. That's a secondary level where it is thought. And in fact, from the Buddhist point of view, that attention's object is not really the visual stimuli. It's really a kind of occurring after the actual experience of the stimuli. At the same time, however, since attention is considered in Buddhist psychology to be one of the 5 what is known as the omnipresent mental factors, which suggest that it is present in all mental experiences. So within the part of the field of the visual experience itself, there is a faculty that is an attention. So there must be an attention that directs that visual experience, sensory experience, to that particular stimuli. So you have different levels of attention and different categories.
자, 두 쉐비는 배지 안다 도믹 코르디에베 일체버티기 인신 된소야 요마가 다 똑베 코르디에베 일체버티기 일체버 타게 인신 된게 요나면아 양 인신 돼야 된다 유미 그도 가다 지기 어려한다 정도에 근데 띵지 사야지 배가 성수 가서 지금 신의 고백도 띵지 말아 봐 심하게 유리야 뜻도 되게 never change 띵지티 야 링은 내용도 와 듬범 더 참바다 띵지 싫어 나고 유치다 버려 좀 유미 싶으셔 아 오시면 와
So it's very complicated and also it is
I myself not very clear.
For example, like His Holiness spoke of the second level of attention, the level of thought. Now the question is it this attention that gives rise to the apprehension of the object, the ascertainment that follows? From the point of view of Buddhist epistemology, again, this is not very clear because we have another set of mental factors known as the 5 factors of ascertainment, where a level of stability or level of concentration is required. So it is generally understood that it is this faculty of constant single-pointedness that is what gives rise to ascertainment. It's not just attention. So His Holiness was saying that he himself is not very sure.
The thing is that 까먹은 배지간 대한민국의 시고마다 자는 중부터 시고마다 그 릉신기 lokanta kanine 미부텔이야 되베시고 디간 떠스야지.
So when we speak of these mental factors, for example, the 5 factors of mental factors of ascertainment, which includes a faculty of single-pointedness, we are not talking about an heightened, trained level of mind. It's a naturally occurring faculty that we all experience. It's
for a very brief period.
Yeah, for brief period. There is also a mindfulness that accompanies. So the 5 factors of ascertainment are aspiration, confidence or trust, mindfulness, single-pointedness, and intelligence. Because if in our normal experience, cognitive experience, if there is no instance of little stability, then we will never be able to apply intelligence. So within the 5 factors, omnipresent mental factors, there's one faculty, a factor known as sempa, which is probably translated as will.
Yeah.
But again, how do you define will as opposed to attention? That is another problem.
We heard this stuff.
Thank you, Your Holiness. First, let me correct myself. We have until 11:45, so that gives us 45 more minutes. And I'm wondering, Anne, whether you might be able to speak to this question which concerns the relation of thought or judgment to attention that was just raised by His Holiness.
Yes, I'm not sure how relevant this point would be, but certainly in the cognitive psychology tradition, we've been interested in distinguishing different levels of processing. So at the lowest level, we have the sensory characteristics of the stimulus, and then as you move up through different levels, you would reach eventually the meaning. But there is some suggestion that, in fact, conscious experience goes directly to the meaning, that we actually access consciously the highest level faster than the low levels, and it takes more effort to get the sensory properties unchanged by all the interpretations that we spontaneously make. Another point that I think might be relevant that's coming to the fore in psychology now is the big differentiation between processes that are explicit, that is, information that we are consciously aware of, and processes that are still implicit. And there may be, we're finding that there may be a great deal of information which is registered in the head. We can show it through evidence of priming, for example, or in patients with brain damage who have lost access, are no longer able to attend to something or to interpret it. We may show nevertheless that the information has got into their heads somewhere. So what attention may be doing is making explicit information that has already been registered at the sensory level and limiting what we can access consciously. A question that I wanted to ask the Buddhist philosophers is, do you think that you also expand what we can access consciously down through these different levels, down to the sensory level, away from our spontaneous coding, which seems to be the most cognitive level, the gist, the meaning, the interpretation, the relevance to us?
Ajahn or His Holiness? Ajahn, why don't you lead us off?
Certainly, the quality of attention is definitely, as Alan very eloquently pointed out, is very definitely seen as being something that is trainable and developable, can be developed in very refined ways in the Buddhist tradition. And over consistent practice and effort, usually training the mind through focusing on a particularly simple or unified object repeatedly over many hours, many days, weeks or years for periods of extended time each day. Then capacities to focus to a more and more refined level can be established quite clearly. Accomplished meditators are known to be able to just sustain their attention duration-wise on a single object exclusively for hours or if not days on end. And similarly, at the level of of refinement,
sensory detail or semantic associations, or
it would depend on the object. And also depend on the decision of the person who's focusing, that you can choose to have an extremely refined focus, or you can have it somewhat broader. In terms of attending to things in a refined level, certainly there are some people that are capable of finding the difference between the actual sense contact and where the mind would actually perceive, or even before naming it, this is green or this is red, even before that's articulated, they will be able to ascertain that very, very close range. Obviously, not everyone is able to do that, but it's certainly the more deeply developed the meditation is, then the quicker you are into the process, and the mapping of the perceptual process, whereby there's in terms of the eye, the eye and light coming together, and then the two forming what's called eye consciousness in Buddhist psychology, and then the three of those together, then conditioning feeling, like an initial percept of pleasant, painful, or neutral, attractive, or unattractive, or neutral. And then there's what's called sanya, or the designation, so that it is the initial, prior to naming, it's just like, the brain says, oh, this is the color and it's of this particular intensity, and then the naming or the thought element comes in subsequent to that, so that given refined training, the attention can be sustained at that contact level.
David, did you have something you wanted to add?
I actually wanted to change the subject slightly by mentioning in this day and age, we actually have a quite different kind of problem, which is not sustaining our attention, but rather needing to shift it back and forth very often. So in current times, people are suffering from a disorder of being mad. And by mad, I do not mean angry. I mean they are suffering from multitasking addiction disorder. So
that's a piece of jargon we need to translate, I think.
So I'm sure Your Holiness is quite familiar with this these days in your own life, because even this weekend you will be needing to change back and forth between a variety of activities, one after the other, very quickly. And possibly this is driving you mad. You are developing multitasking addiction disorder. You're having to do too many tasks all at the same time. And the question is, both from the scientific perspective and from the spiritual contemplative perspective, how can we deal with this in modern life when we are inundated, deluged with cell phones, the internet, computers, and I don't know what other gadgets you have right there, but there are at least 3 or 4 of them, and they're all causing us great headaches. Now, we scientists have tried to approach this topic by understanding in more detail what takes place in the mind and the brain while people are trying to cope with multitasking. We have discovered through our research, which is primarily experimental in nature, that in fact it appears from our theoretical standpoint that in the mind there are executive mental processes, somewhat like a chief executive officer of a big company or corporation, that are responsible for allocating the mind's resources, the memory, the attention, the perception, and so forth, to dealing with one task or another, either at the same time or in rapid succession. Much like we're doing right here when the audience out there is trying to listen to us, watch the screen, and do a whole bunch of other stuff, talk to their friends. And the question is, how do we know these executive processes that allocate our mental resources are present, and what is their nature? So we've been conducting experimental research where we ask people to perform 2 or more tasks at the same time, somewhat like cell phoning and driving, or like trying to write a report on your computer while getting constantly interrupted with telephone calls. And we have been making measurements of people's behavior, including how quickly and how accurately they are able to perform the tasks at the same time in order to get the job done. What we find can be is that under lots of conditions, depending on exactly what the tasks are, individuals have great difficulty, at least at first, in doing this so-called multitasking. So, for example, if we take an individual such as Jonathan here, and we give him a couple of even very easy tasks to do, such as, Jonathan, whenever I hold up a finger, you just tell me how many there are. Can you do that?
Try 1.
That's excellent. 2. Good. So that's a task. This is a visual task involving a verbal response. Now let's give you another task. If I go beep, I want you to say hi. And if I go boop, I want you to say low. Can you do that?
I can try. Beep. Hi.
Boop.
Low.
Now I want you to do it really fast. Beep.
Hi. 1.
Okay. Now let's see. Now let's see how you do when we actually...
You've got other subjects, you know.
Turnabout is fair play.
They were afraid that we were going to ask the Buddhists to be the guinea pigs, but it looks like we're turning the to. Hello.
He's actually doing pretty well, folks, but he's had prior training. And this is one of our major discoveries, which is, at first, especially when you're dealing with tasks that will conflict with each other because, for example, they both involve language, it's very difficult. Even cell phoning while driving, despite what the automobile companies would like you to believe, is difficult because driving, just like cell phoning, involves talking to yourself. You have to read signs. You have to think about what you want to do next when you're in traffic. And we find under those circumstances, the performance in terms of speed and accuracy is very poor. But with appropriate practice and training, we can get people to develop strategies for multitasking that make their executive mental processes be more efficient. And it is possible, as a result of such training, to help overcome differences that exist at first between people in their ability to multitask. So this raises a number of interesting questions from the scientific perspective, which could feed very directly into insights and wisdom provided by contemplative traditions like Buddhism, because, for example, what would the Buddhist perspective be able to tell not only the scientists but also the public about how they should try to deal with being mad, that is, having this multitasking addiction disorder, also OCD, online compulsive disorder? What is to be done? What is to be done from this, not only from the scientific perspective, but from, say, the Buddhist perspective, where now what's not necessarily wanted is long, sustained focus of the attention on one object, but rather the ability to switch effortlessly back and forth between one task or another.
Is there a response, perhaps, from the Buddhist side with regards to this? Alan first, and then maybe just brief, we can ask Ajahn.
The training of focusing on a single object is really preparatory to using the attention in a myriad of other ways. And in fact, in a wide variety of other Buddhist meditative techniques, many of them in Tibetan Buddhism, there's multitasking in Buddhism. And that is, on the one hand, you may be engaging in some ritual action with your hands.
This is even without cell phones?
Yes, believe it or not. Sure. You may be engaging in ritual behavior with your hands. You may be chanting something verbally and engaging in a rather complex, multifaceted visualization. You're creating mental imagery all at the same time, and you're multitasking across the different channels over a period of an hour, 2 hours, 5 hours, 10 hours. And that's really standard kind of practice.
Alan, are there specific practices that focus on that particular ability, or is that something that you encounter, but there's no particular training that is dedicated to it?
The training itself is dedicated to itself. That is, you develop those abilities by engaging in this multitasking type of meditative practice. And you may, if you wish, engage in a more simple meditative practice. First, focus on a single, simple object, honing stability and vividness, and then at some point, then shifting over and then applying it to these much more complex meditative practices. But some people choose not to take the preliminary. They'll develop the stability and vividness right in the midst of the more complex practice.
And can I infer from other things that have been said that the same applies here as to, say, learning more focused abilities? That is, that initially it's hard, but that ultimately you come to a state where you can be able to do this multitasking with greater relaxation and comfort? Because that would seem to have some therapeutic consequences to the...
Ajahn, did you want to contribute here?
Generally, these two qualities are developed in parallel, and they support each other. So one in Buddhist jargon would be called concentration practice, and that's specifically and generally focusing on a single object, like I talked about before. The other is what we use the term mindfulness more readily for, which is developing usually more of an all-round sense of the moment and what's going on. So that someone, as Alan was talking about it in terms of a kind of particular religious practice, but it's also in terms of the normal flow of life in a monastery. And oftentimes when you meet a great master like His Holiness, and, despite what he might think, he just shook his head there. But might say, great teachers that I have known, it's astonishing how they can be in a group of people like this, or maybe 30 or 40 people, they can be actually serving 8 or 10 different people in 8 different ways simultaneously. So one person will say, oh, well, wasn't it wonderful how clear he was about that point? And I say, oh, I felt he was really loving when he did this. No, wasn't it really interesting how he moved his hands all the time? And that they're actually attending to the needs and the particular responses from several people all at the same time. And each individual will have a sense of being perfectly attended to. But the most interesting thing in this light is from the subjective point of view of the person who's speaking, is that they're not thinking, I've got to take care of that one, and what about this one, and oh dear, that one over there. It actually, the more that the quality of mindfulness and concentration is developed, then the more that flows naturally, and so that there's no kind of forcedness. So it's not actually exhausting to multitask, so that it's and it's not even really burdensome for someone who's very accomplished and experienced.
So would you say that after the development of this ability, you actually can simultaneously, without conflict between the various types of tasks, get them all done at the same time, as if you were doing only one?
I would think so. I think it depends tremendously on the attitude with which you're picking it up. Because I noticed in the way you phrased it that multitasking addictive disorder, because I would say that the addiction is different from the multitasking, and so that.
Before we turn to the audience questions, I'd like to turn to Nancy.
Yeah, well, I'm very happy to hear that I can stay on email all the time and sign up unwholesome. But I wanted to get back to the temporal structure of awareness that Alan mentioned briefly, and that's also relevant to this issue of multitasking. There's quite a bit of work going on now in cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience looking at the rate of perceptual and cognitive processing and its temporal properties. So just to give the flavor of a few examples, there is evidence that people can recognize an object in about 1/10 of a second, maybe 2/10 of a second. You can present a rapid sequence of completely unrelated complex scenes to people at a rate of 8 per second, and they will extract the gist of each one, more or less accurately. There's also work showing that at that kind of presentation rate, people can often be aware of each of the items in a sequence, but under some circumstances, some of those items will simply fail to enter awareness at all. And there's reason to believe they get processed in some ways, but fail to enter awareness. So there's a lot of work going on the temporal structure of awareness, and I was fascinated to hear the notion that a moment is 10 milliseconds. And I want to know, is that consistent or inconsistent, and where does that come from, and how does that fit?
Shall I start then? There is this notion in Buddhism that cognition consists of a sequence of pulses of cognition. When I've used the word 1 millisecond, of course Tibetans did not have precise watches to measure it. What they do is take a finger snap and say, that was 65. Although I've heard there's some discussion about 64, and I think it's probably a matter of the thickness of the thumb. Be that as it may, if a finger snap is roughly 1/10 of a second and you're dividing it into 65, then you have on the order of 1 millisecond. Having said that, the Buddhist position is that a single millisecond of cognition almost invariably, if not invariably, does not actually ascertain anything by itself. It's too brief. But if you have a sequence of these and there's a certain homogeneity, there's a temporal binding process that takes place over if they are focusing on the same object, and there's like a cumulative effect. And after some multitude of these milliseconds, whether it's 10 or 40 or 100, then you click and you ascertain. Now, the hypothesis that I would raise for this type of attentional training is that as you're enhancing the clarity of attention, and in my understanding, increasing the density of these actually ascertaining clusters of consciousness, that you'd be able to pick up things of greater rapidity, or that is a briefer, shorter duration, and also in a single moment be able to pick up more detail. So that's a hypothesis. It's just waiting to be tested.
Yeah, here's an empirical opportunity.
Can I just follow up and ask, what kinds of things do people report when they ascertain these 10 millisecond moments? Is there anything that can be said about it, or is this necessarily just first person? If you reach this insight, you can't share it with anybody.
John, would you have any comment?
Well, it is. I mean, some of the brain imaging techniques that I've been shown in the last couple of days by work that Richie Davidson and others have done kind of got me thinking that maybe you can measure this from the outside. But this is generally subjective experience, so that it's said that, say, the Buddha's most senior disciple, Sariputta, was supposed to be such an accomplished meditator, so skilled at concentration and attentive abilities, he could actually track not only each individual mind moment, but the 17 different parts of an individual mind moment. And that when the Buddha said, okay, well, describe how you experience this when you're in very deep concentration, and he laid out the pattern of events as he experienced them, and the Buddha said, it's like you've taken a cup full of water and you've described where each of the molecules of the water came from. It's well done, Sariputta. So whether you can actually measure that from outside with one of these wonderful gadgets here at MIT or in Wisconsin, I don't know. But certainly it's down to the report of the individual and their capacity to describe their experience so far.
Your Holiness, is there anything you would like to add to the discussion here before we turn to an audience question?
집은 로 컴베치 수십의 인사지 그런 류로 단지보다 다 들려요 르지고 땡 템버사시도 사다 땡 템베터네 이 컴베치수 거다 야게르야디 가서 그게 무튼이 야게르야디 숙성수지 연구해서 르 캐버 수젠다 메라지
In Buddhist psychology, there is a recognition of what one could call kind of the certain laws of psychology, if one can call it, which is that compared to characteristics and properties that are based on the body, mental states are thought to have certain unique characteristics, one of which is that through constant familiarity and habituation, mental states can be enhanced and developed further. So that's one important feature. Another important feature is that mental states and characteristics are thought to have a more stable basis compared to the physical characteristics. So on the basis of these two premises, there is at least an acknowledgement in the Buddhist psychology and epistemology that many of the mental states can be trained and enhanced.
Thank you. Then let's turn to one of the audience questions.
I've got three, and I think one is for the Buddhists, and one is for the scientists, and one is, I think, for both. So I'm going to start with the last. A teenager can be totally attentive on a second-by-second level and yet be both relaxed and enjoying the experience for hours. We call this video gaming. The same teenager has difficulty with attention at school. So the real question, the key question, says this member of the audience, is the study of attention to boring stimuli.
Concerning the study of attention on boring stimuli, on simple stimuli. Is there someone from either side who would like to take this up?
Sure, why not?
So we've got David and Nancy both feel like they would like to. Nancy, why don't you start us off?
Okay. Well, I was just going to note that there's a recent study by a cognitive psychologist named Daphne Bavillier, who has shown that, in fact, I guess I'm addressing the audience, that video game playing can lead to surprisingly powerful benefits in visual attention in very different tasks. This is something that I think many of us in the field did not expect. I don't know if it's what the questioner wanted to hear, but the effects are quite striking. Go ahead.
David, did you want to amplify on that?
Well, I'm not sure I'd buy into the idea that the tasks whose performance we study in the lab are entirely boring. And in fact, in a lot of respects, we try to create situations in the lab that are much like playing video games. We provide appropriate encouragement for good performance. We reward this, and often the people whom we study tell us that they would then like to pay us to come back and do it again. So we wind up, I think we wind up being able to reach conclusions about the nature of attention and control, not only in the performance of boring tasks, but also in the performance of ones that are actually similar to what you sometimes have in real life with activities like video game playing.
Right. Alan?
In the discipline training of the attention, you tend to focus on a single object or a process, for example, like the breathing. For the first 15 seconds or so, that might be quite interesting. And then after that, you may say, you've seen one breath, you've seen them all. I personally find video games very boring, so I don't even glance in their direction. So I think the issue of how interesting something is or how it rivets our attention is not simply a quality of the object, but our relationship to it. I have spent a fair amount of time attending to the breath, not because I just have a fetish for breathing, although I do like to continue with it, but rather there's a higher order interest in it.
So you basically agree with the police, is that correct? With the police. Every breath you take, every move you make, I'll be watching you?
I'll go along with that. But just a final point here, and then there's a higher order level of interest, and that is even if the breathing after a time or some generated mental image that you're focusing on and using that as your referent for stabilizing the attention, after a while it just can't be interesting objectively anymore. It's just sitting there, right? But there's a higher order level of interest in seeing if I do this, there are anticipated benefits, rather like plugging through medical school for 4 years. It can't be all interesting, but you're anticipating getting out of it.
Exactly. Well, in fact, what we find is that by providing appropriate feedback in the lab, people get really into monitoring the progress of their own performance and the acquisition of higher order levels of skill. And this then provides a self-sustaining motive to continue doing it, even though some of these tasks at a lower level might be construed, at least by the audience, as being quite boring.
But that very monitoring process itself, it can be fascinating.
Yeah,
exactly.
I think this comes back to that meta-attention that you were bringing up. Ajahn?
Just a brief point. I think there's a mixture of things happening. Certainly, say, the skills in developing attention might be developed through repetitious activity and fine-tuning of focus in such a task, which is maybe why it's increasing skills in certain academic areas. But on the other side, you got the habituation element. And so that with the way that films are made, you know, the average clip of in a film is just a few seconds, or very, very brief. So that what that means is one gets bored more easily. And so that if you need a high level of rapidly changing stimuli to keep your attention, then as soon as things drop below that level, then I'm bored. I want to do something new, I want to do something different. And so that these are two very, very contrasting elements that are involved in that. And so that I think that why teenagers might be harmed or damaged, or even adults, by repetitious, high-intensity activity, is that we become depressed and restless because we need so much coming in order to make us feel okay. So one of the points of learning to develop attention with extremely boring objects or not interesting, like the breath, is so that you learn to establish that quality of attention and ease with the present moment with an absolute minimum of stimuli, so that you can be basically feel at home in yourself with very little going on. If a teenager needs to have the video game going and the stereo playing at the same time and be checking their emails simultaneously, and then they feel good, then that's a lot of hardware to keep going to make me feel at home in my life.
You can tell. And perhaps you can tell that Ajahn is a forest monk.
I also have an iPad.
Perhaps we can turn to a second question.
Jonathan wanted to say something first, I think.
Well, actually, I had a question. If there was one from the floor, then I'm happy to.
Maybe we can take one more from the floor.
Why don't I take this one? Is actually in some ways directed to His Holiness as well as to the other Buddhists, and it's by Eric Jacobson from Harvard Medical School. He points out that Alan gave a lucid summary of the Gelugpa mind training perspective vis-a-vis attention, but that there are other methods of mental cultivation in other schools of Tibetan Buddhism that may be equally relevant to the cultivation of attention, and points out that Your Holiness is very well trained and familiar in these areas as well. He asks about the relevance of mantra practices and of ritual practices in which deities are visualized and interacted with, and how might these understandings be now incorporated into the conversation we're having about attentional training.
Actually, the perspective that we are bringing upon in the discussion here is from the Buddhist tradition, which is actually a common tradition known as the Abhidhamma tradition, which is the tradition of Buddhist psychology. And so within the, in the Tibetan tradition, there is a recognition of two different systems of Abhidhamma, the upper and the lower Abhidhamma system. In fact, with regard to the reference to mantra recitation, in fact, in the very meditation manual which gives the mantra recitation, there's an explicit statement which says that when the practitioner is wearied after meditation, then recite the mantras. So the actual meditation is not the mantra recitation.
Okay.
Of course, of course, you know, in the process of training the cultivation of attention, then that attention can be used to different focuses, such as it could be a visualization of certain imagery, or it could be internal mental processes, or it could be some external material object.
Or the nature of the mind itself.
No, that's it.
Yeah. Any other comments? But I'd like to continue with these the audience questions. Do you have a comment concerning this particular?
Jonathan, this one is for you anyway. It's actually for all, so don't worry, we'll get you back in. It's this doesn't have a name, but it's directed for Jonathan Cohn, and it says, Buddhist meditation involves training attentional capacities. Psychology assumes that subjects have no particular attentional training. If you, and I actually am going to take the liberty of expanding this question to all of you, because you're all laboratory scientists, if you all had access to a pool of subjects highly trained in attention, how might you use them in your research paradigm? What new questions could you ask or begin to answer?
Maybe first Jonathan and then David.
Well, actually, this is the exact inverse of the question I was going to ask. So maybe I'll try and provide an answer, but maybe with somewhat of a question in return. There's all kinds of phenomenally interesting claims that have been made about Buddhist practice that are extremely interesting from the perspective of some of the issues that I tried to lay out in the opening comments, and that we've heard discussed also in the conversation. I mean, how quickly can you switch attention? I mean, we have made measurements under at least certain circumstances, but as the questioner notes, with naive subjects. How much can we exceed the capacity to switch based on what we've measured so far when appropriate training has been given to the subject? How early in the stream? I mean, I think it's interesting to us, the claim that Ajahn made earlier, that you can really direct attention to the very earliest stages of processing, perhaps earlier than we've been able to measure in naive subjects. And so it was, I have to say, it was a great temptation when we came to this meeting, I'll be quite honest, to view the Buddhists as guinea pigs. I mean, we'd heard all these incredible claims, and the first temptation was to say, let's get them in the laboratory and start measuring these things. And of course, when they came to the table, they wanted to talk about the theory and the philosophy as well. And I'll be totally honest about my perspective, and I sense that at least a couple of other of my colleagues came initially with this attitude. It was like, well, it was almost as if you were going to talk to you were interested in psychophysics and you were going to study a major league pitcher. Right, and you were interested in how they threw the ball so fast, and they wanted to tell you their philosophy about, how it was they did it, which had to do with which way they point their shoes in their locker before the game. And you go, look, I'll figure out how. You just do it for me, right? And for me, I have to say, and I think this is true for all of us, that the most gratifying part of this experience has been to be disabused of that narrowness of mind and to realize that there's some really interesting ideas that stand behind the claims. And so the way I'd like to turn the question on its head is say, look, I can think of a million things to measure, but what I'm interested in is what do you think the right things to measure would be? Because that would instruct us as much in psychology. In our perspective, as it would allow us to understand yours better. So if the questioner will permit me,
I think so.
We would like to hear what the Buddhists, and why. I mean, what would you gain by making these measurements?
I would like to see something very practical come out of the research, especially in terms of mental health. In the West, there is a marvelous science of mental illness. But once you get to normal, you're pretty much shuttled out of the door. Because you've gotten to the level of the psychiatrist, and if you did anything more, it'd be embarrassing. So to have a... To have a clear vision of what mental health is, and exceptional mental health, and the upper end of mental health, and then practical strategies for developing way beyond normal. We know what it's like to be physically normal, but then we have Olympic athletes, and we say, well, wow, that's a way beyond normal. What would it be like to have an Olympic status of mental health? What would be the constituent parts? So I would love to see that studied.
I'd like...
Ajahn, did you want to?
Yeah, just as a PS to that, in Buddhist philosophy, one is not considered sane until one is fully enlightened. So the bar is set at a slightly different place, where if one can cope.
But how are the tools of modern science going to help us better understand how to get there? I mean, what specific experiments could we do that would inform Buddhist practice and help improve that?
Well, one of the things, just in looking at some of the brain scan images that we looked at yesterday before this meeting, one of the interesting things that came to my mind was to see what the effects of say, one's behavior and particularly the ethical quality of one's lifestyle is in terms of self-image, and how you might, say, have a positive self-image through the way that you conduct yourself, or that how you spend your time. How one's sense of comfort in life and your sense of connecting with others is associated with the way that you live, and the way how honest you are, or how prone you are to acting violently or aggressively. Because in all of these different studies, I haven't seen that kind of ethical element. I know there's a great urge to divide the ethical element from research. But as His Holiness often points out, that ethics is not to do with religion. It's a natural human quality, and it has a powerful effect. And so that a research that could actually show demonstrably that you are not just subjectively saying, yeah, I feel better, but also it's actually proving very clearly, medically and psychologically, that to live an ethical lifestyle, to not act harmfully, to be honest, and so forth, actually genuinely improves the quality of life, no matter what age you are, from early childhood on up.
Nancy, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up and say, so it sounds to me like you're advocating a study of the neural correlates of wholesome behavior or an ethical lifestyle. And as a neuroscientist, that seems of some interest, but I'm curious what you think you would get out of that. I mean, after all, you don't need our pretty brain pictures to decide on what kind of life you want to live.
Well, what I get out of it is a healthier world and the delight of humanity being in a better state than it was before.
And how does neuroscience contribute?
Because the information
How does neuroscience specifically contribute to that, is what I'm asking.
Well, I would say it would, because people believe in the great God of data.
So it's a PR tool.
It's a PR, and that's...
So one side is, you might say, the validation of something which is held to be a tenet within Buddhism, but is actually, in some ways, perhaps viewed with a certain amount of uncertainty, at least.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's one, but is that all, I think, is what you're asking. And perhaps that's not a sufficient motivation for scientists to get involved, to provide PR. So, Alan?
Yeah. First-person reports, as William James recognized, are dubious. We can make and do make errors about our own subjective experience and be extremely confident about them. And so in a contemplative setting, you have some checks and balances. You go to your teacher and you report, and sometimes your teacher says, well, you just given that self-report, you're wrong. I'm observing you from a second person, the mentor's perspective, and I have to correct you here, you're wrong. And so there's dialogue there. And so that's already some checks and balances, but sometimes the mentor may be wrong. Maybe the mentor's not clairvoyant, just maybe. In which case, if we have some psychological measures, and if we have some neuroscientific measures, it's like as if, metaphorically, we're developing a three-dimensional perspective here, vectoring in from different angles, different avenues, that then can give us a greater confidence of what's going on. That could be enormously helpful for contemplatives and generally in spiritual practice to evaluate how are you in fact doing.
One mark from David, and then we're going to have to be coming to our close. Please.
It seems like what's really possible here is a feedback loop between first-person perspectives and third-person perspectives, in which, for example, a first-person perspective can provide direct evidence that a third-person measurement is a manifestation of a particular desired or undesirable mental state. And we can then investigate through certain kinds of training and practice what it takes to move one closer and closer to that third-person apparent state. And in the course of that, especially once it has been reached by someone who wasn't there before, it may be possible for them to report back and verify from the first-person perspective that, in fact, they have now moved from one place to another, and around you go. And in order for this to take place, individuals coming from different approaches have to be engaged in the overall synthesis.
Right. So that there is an opportunity and a value in the collaboration. Your Holiness, we'd like to close, but we'd like to give you the last word if you'd like to make a final remark or contribution.
Nothing much to add. Nothing more to add, but Jonathan's presentation and the subsequent discussion still keep triggering this interest on His Holiness's part about this ancient debate within the Buddhist world among the epistemologists about what of the three models of this split egg and one instance of precept as opposed to multiplicity of objects and equal, parallel numbers of precepts equal to the richness in the stimuli. Within these three perspectives, there's been a lot of debate, but doesn't seem to have been any kind of real settlement. So His Holiness's curiosity has been kind of raised by the possibility of using some of the modern scientific instrument and method, probably to determine who was right.
All of our curiosities have been stimulated, and I think we've begun already the collaboration we've been hoping for. So please come back at 1:30. We'll be beginning punctually at 1:30.